Greetings, everyone, and welcome to a forum, a very important forum being sponsored by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, on Russian disinformation against Ukraine and how that challenge has changed. We have an incredible lineup of panelists and speakers to interact with all of you. I'm Steve Clemons. I'm editor-at-large of a new global publication called Semaphore. I should say I've got a great colleague online, Jay Solomon. This is my shout out to him, who's just starting a new security newsletter. So go sign up for that. That's my one commercial, and a salute to Jay. But look, we're talking about something very, very important. We're on the eve of the 1-year anniversary of the formal invasion of Ukraine on February 24th by Russia. I don't like the date because I look at February 23rd as the date because that's when the cyber war began, and we should begin testing our own biases as we think about conflict and what has gone on. And we have the perfect panel to help us discuss our biases, discuss how things have evolved, and discuss what's been happening over this last year and how the Ukrainians, frankly, in a very valiant stand for their rights and for their nation, have basically dealt with the media and information side of things. So to open things up, I'd like to introduce Jamie Fly, who has resumed his leadership at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty as president and CEO, following his reappointment recently in 2021 from the same role in 2019. I've known Jamie Fly for a long time. He's been incredibly involved in national security and foreign policy affairs, and also the values dimensions of this. He has served as co-director of the Alliance for Security Democracy. He was director of the Future of Geopolitics and Asia programs at the German Marshall Fund. He was a counselor for foreign and national security affairs to Senator Marco Rubio. He was executive director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. He served in the Department of Defense and many other roles, and received and was awarded the Office of Secretary of Defense Medal for Exceptional Public Service. So Jamie, help frame us, help launch us, and then we're going to get into a really powerful and compelling discussion.
Great, thanks, Steve. And I'll just make some brief comments and then get out of the way because we've got fantastic speakers, as Steve noted. RFERL is very happy to host this important discussion. We, as many of you I think know, but in case you're unfamiliar with us, we're a multimedia news organization which is funded by the US Congress, but we're editorially independent of the US government. We cover 23 countries across Eurasia, providing content in 27 languages. And obviously, in our coverage region, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine over the last year has been the big news story of the last 12 months, and we've been covering that from multiple angles. So we wanted to sponsor this conversation to hear the Ukrainian government perspective, but then also talk to a number of independent journalists and observers who have been on the front line covering these events over the last year. I want to thank the speakers. Unfortunately, the minister, Shevchenko, was unable to join us, but I want to thank Deputy Minister Shevchenko for replacing him. And I also want to thank Olga Rudenko, Peter Dickinson, and our own Natalie Sedleska for joining the panel. And I want to thank Steve for agreeing to moderate. Just briefly about what we've been doing in Ukraine over the last year. Obviously, the full-scale invasion has been a direct assault on the Ukrainian people, but it's also been an information assault. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, and the experiences that the Ukrainians have learned along the way. The costs have been immense, including the cost to independent news organizations. Many journalists have been caught up in this conflict. Unfortunately, we lost one of our own, Radio Svoboda producer Vera Hirich, who was killed in a missile strike in her apartment in Kyiv last April. In addition to Vera, there have been dozens of journalists who have been killed or injured while covering the war. We also have another colleague, Vlad Yesipchenko, who was illegally detained in Russian-occupied Crimea before the war. Many other journalists have been put at risk or targeted by Russian forces in a variety of different ways. Obviously, there's been extreme suffering caused by the full-scale invasion for Ukrainians. They've had to endure, especially those in occupied areas, torture, mistreatment, atrocities, alleged war crimes. And our own team has seen this recently, just the challenges of living through this daily onslaught against the Ukrainian power infrastructure and key critical infrastructure on a regular basis. And then we've obviously reported on and followed the significant displacement of refugees outside of the country. We're reporting on the war every day, and we'll continue to do so with our significant presence on the ground. We have more than 150 journalists reporting from inside Ukraine. That frontline reporting is some of the most popular reporting over the last year that we've produced across all of our countries, not just Ukraine. We make available that content from the front lines in all of our other languages. And perhaps most importantly, for the fate of the war in the future, we make that content available to Russian-speaking audiences inside Russia, and we go to great lengths to inform Russians who are facing this onslaught of propaganda on a nightly basis on TV talk shows about what is actually happening on the ground. And we report on the stories of Ukrainians who have been affected in horrific ways by this war. And I will say, despite a lot of the pessimism out there about what's going on inside Russia, we do see significant numbers of Russians responding to that reporting and being drawn to factual reporting about the war. So I want to thank you for joining this conversation and for listening to the panelists. And I want to return the microphone now to our moderator, Steve Clemons, and to the panel. Thanks.
Jamie, thank you so much for those words, those sobering words. I also want to remind our audience that we will be taking questions at the end, and we're going to have right now a conversation that looks at essentially the information wars that have gone on during this past year, how they've evolved. And I'll tell you something I learned in a political science introduction class a long time ago. I learned that, you know, if you're trying to learn the norms and habits and what really matters in a society, don't watch it when the sun is shining. You have to watch it when it's under stress. And Ukraine today is under incredible stress. So the conversation about how journalism works, how these brave writers and journalists have been able to do their job and what the factors are is part of the conversation. Also the world of disinformation. And so I want to thank what we have today. Let me introduce, we have Taras Shevchenko, who has come in for the Minister of Information and Culture Policy in Ukraine, but he's no stand-in. He is a franchise unto himself. He's co-founder of the Reanimation Package of Reforms, a coalition reform-oriented of NGOs and experts, which began after the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine. So he is the Deputy Minister of Culture and Information Policy of Ukraine. So great to have Deputy Minister Shevchenko. We have Olga Rudenko, who is the chief editor of the Kyiv Independent, an award-winning media startup launched in November of 2021 by the former editorial team of the Kyiv Post. She was the deputy chief editor of the Kyiv Post, and she's written for publications all over the world and was featured on the cover of Time magazine in May 2022, just recently, as one of the publication's next generation leaders. We also have Peter Dickinson, who is the editor of the Ukraine Alert blog at the Eurasia Center and the publisher of the Business Ukraine and Lviv Today magazines. He was born in the UK, permanent resident of Ukraine for nearly 20 years. He does outstanding work. I can just say, get online and read his stuff, vital. And then we have Natalie Sedlecka. She's an award-winning investigative journalist and host of the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Ukrainian Service investigative program, Schemes and Corruption in Details. In 2013, she was awarded a Václav Havel Journalism Fellowship to work with RFERL in Prague. She's got many, many other credentials of being on the front line of looking at anti-corruption efforts and corruption, frankly, in these countries. So let me start by asking Deputy Minister Shevchenko to open up and look back at the last year. We have a lot of people online who've been following this, so we don't need to go to a primer level. But tell us the topography from your perspective of what are the most important features of how Russia's engagement on the information side has evolved and how your own strategies have evolved.
Thank you very much for the question. What's the timing for my response?
You've got a couple of minutes.
Okay, so if it's very briefly, I like actually to start with identifying that the word disinformation in English language came from Russian. So it's originated in Russian language. And even if now you check Russian language Wikipedia, you'll see that the definition of disinformation as it's in Russian Wikipedia is pretty positive. It says that it's, I'll translate, deliberately false or change information that you give to your enemy or victim or even like business partner for more effective way to conduct military operations or cooperation or to check the leak of information. So that's the way how Russians identify disinformation. I think the biggest lessons that we learned and the way how we changed approach, and I think European Union and other countries are changing their approach to tackling disinformation. I think a few years ago, it was the major way of dealing was kind of looking for fake news, finding them, and then making them public and debunking them, and in this regards, repeating actual disinformation. It does not work, especially in the world when the disinformation is actually part of military operation of the enemy, and those people who involved there in disinformation, they actually working as the part of military aggression, and responding in that way is not enough at all. The three ways where we see the responses is actually, and the most important, which started being done on European level as well, is blocking, because it's when the channel of disinformation done by organized by military or close to military like people, and the only reason for having Russia TV channel is Russia Today TV channel is actually to change minds of people in favor of Russian governments in regards to the military operation. The only thing government shall do is actually blocking. So blocking, right. I will not tell a lot because it's short time, is became one of the primary reasoning for the closing the voices that are only disseminated disinformation. Of course, everything should be done in the balance, and as it's like another coin is providing information, being open, and supporting freedom of expression. But without blocking voices, it's impossible to deal with the problem. The blocking also includes local legislation and work of local regulators. The second part is resilience. Ukrainians has very high morale, and the opinion polls are showing that. Ukrainians and with are quite aware about Russian media, and it's only like 2% of people only in some regions who trust Russian sources. The media literacy project filter that we organize as a governmental project is also important part of raising such awareness. And the third part is informing. The government communication, the way how president is communicated both inside Ukraine and abroad, I think is very, very good. We have Center of Strategic Communication that we launch under the ministry. So the part of informing and providing space both internally and externally with your information, with news, with data is also a very important part of dealing with disinformation. So blocking, resilience, informing, I think these are three pillars. And why I emphasize on blocking. First of all, because it's, I think, something new, something different, and something as even like for me as a freedom of speech advocate for many, many years was something probably like surprising. And that's the change of those principles that were established after Second World War for mostly peaceful Europe, for peaceful European countries. So I think I'll stop here and be ready to continue with questions or with other.
Taras, thank you. And what I want to say, we're going to bring in three great journalists, but before we go to them, just very quickly, we've got Olga Rudenko on, Peter Dickinson, Natalie Sedlecka. Are they friends of your government? Are they foes, or are they just reasonable acquaintances? In the sense of, how do you look at Ukrainian journalists and even Western journalists that are writing about Ukraine? How do you see them? Because is it a cozy relationship, or is it one that you think has objective distance from your perspective built into it?
My first wish is to say word friends, but my second thinking is friendship is probably not the way of relationship that should be between government and journalists, because journalists still have the watchdog function, and it's like the role is to see what government is doing and criticizing and finding out corruption and other stories. So I think it's positive cooperation, and like everyone is doing their roles, what they need to do, both in time of war or not in time of war.
Thank you very much. I encourage you to stay with us in this conversation we'll have. Let me jump to Natalie now. And Natalie, let me ask you from your perspective, and you worked with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty on project and schemes. I'm really interested in how the disinformation challenge, as you've seen it, and how your work with schemes has changed over this last year.
Sure, of course, Russian disinformation affected a lot the type of stories we are covering. Since February 2022, we shifted from mainly working on corruption and abuse of power issues to uncover the truth behind the lies being told by the invaders and their disinformation outlets. And in this, our team is being helped by many years of experience in the genre of journalistic investigations, sometimes even using similar techniques and instruments as we used before. Well, one of the most obvious and outright deceptions that Russian propaganda has been hysterically spreading since February is that Russian soldiers are not killing or harming peaceful Ukrainians, right? But after all, they came to liberate them. So the images of bombed out Ukrainian cities, schools, hospitals, dead children, tortured women do not align with the slogans under which Putin sent troops into a neighboring sovereign country. That's why a huge part of our work is investigating war crimes committed by the Russian army in Ukraine. We were among the first journalists to investigate the mass deaths in peaceful residents in the occupied city of Mariupol without actually direct access to it, but showing mass burials of people in trenches that were expanding in size every day. As soon as the Ukrainian army pushed the Russian forces out of the occupied cities and villages, our journalists immediately go there to the scene to not only document all the evidence of atrocities committed by the Russian army, but also using our investigative knowledge and skills to specifically identify name by name those Russian military personnel involved. And for example, in the suburbs of the Ukrainian capital, there is a small village called Andriivka, where the Russian troops arrived in the spring, and only 1,000 residents lived there, and 17 of them were killed by Russian occupiers. We also released a series of in-depth investigations from the occupied settlements of Kyiv region. We established by name exactly which of the Russian soldiers were involved in the organization of places where local residents were tortured, simply because they were Ukrainians and did not agree to cooperate. And recently, one Russian soldier made our work much easier. While escaping from Balaklia in the Kharkiv region, he forgot a secret flash drive, which became a key to uncovering the involvement in war crimes of several dozen of Russian soldiers and even their high-ranking supervisors from the Russian Federal Security Service. But not only war crimes, but many other topics that we investigate are essentially an exposure of Russian propaganda lies. For example, that Western sanctions don't really hurt the Russian economy, and Russia won't suffer much if it will be cut from Western markets. If that's the case, then why do our reporters constantly record Russian tankers, for example, with oil products that are forced to come up with new and new schemes to secretly deliver their products to European countries through a series of transshipments bypassing these sanctions? Or just another narrative of Russian propaganda for the domestic consumer, of course, that Russia does not suffer heavy losses on the battlefield. Probably the legendary example, denial that there were many casualties on the Russian warship Moskva. Then why our journalists on the same day were able to calculate and name the names, the Russian military sailors who went down with the Russian flagship sunk by the Ukrainian army? And probably just another example, the use of Iranian drones against Ukraine. Moscow has long denied this fact, calling Iranian Shahed supposedly a Russian development, Gerань-2. Our investigators filmed every detail of the shot down Iranian drone in Ukraine, proving its true origin. And I just recently read in the Russian media that Russia had a record harvest of grain crops last year. Interesting. However, as a series of our investigations have shown, Russian occupiers of southern regions of Ukraine simply appropriated this harvest and exported our Ukrainian wheat to countries like Turkey or Syria under the guise of Russian grain. And although they hid for some reason, disconnecting the vessel navigation tracking system, we actually traced these roads using satellite services and then additional documentary evidence. And just probably the last thing I want to say here, the classic story of prosperous Russia and the bad tainted West. But then why do we continue to find the latest and newest villas of the Russian elite, not in Sochi and Gelendzhik, but in London, Courchevel and Nice? However, as of February, the goal of such investigations by journalists has slightly changed. Now, these hidden and found Russian assets will sooner or later have to be compensated for the huge loss the destructive invasion of Russian troops into a peaceful, sovereign and independent country Ukraine has done.
Well, thank you. We'll come back to you, and thank you so much for the candid perspective. Olga, I'm interested, you know, we're all in journalism. I'm in journalism. I mentioned my colleague, Jay Solomon. I think every day we wake up and say, what's our North Star? What do we cover? Why are we covering it? You know, what matters? What's worth the time and investment? And I'm very interested in the Kyiv Independent, which I read and check in on. Very grateful for the work of you and your colleagues. I guess my question to you is, how do you navigate a wartime battlefield and the different pressures to institute what I read in the Kyiv Independent, which is, you know, a very major attempt of maintaining objectivity, not only about the invasion and what the Russians have done, but also about Ukraine's own performance and government. So, Olga, your thoughts?
Thank you, Steve, and huge thank you for the question actually that you asked Taras Shevchenko before, because indeed it is very important to talk about the relationship of Ukrainian journalists and the government now, and it's actually something I wanted to address in my remarks as well. You mentioned objectivity, and indeed, thank you for saying that it is noticeable that we at the Kyiv Independent really strive for objectivity as much as it is possible. And I'm often asked how we can be unbiased when covering a war that is happening to our own country. And my response to that is that it would be ridiculous if we pretended that we don't have a side in this fight. Everybody working here are either Ukrainians or they are people who have lived in Ukraine for a long time and think of it as their own country. So we obviously have a side. We obviously want Ukraine to win, but at the same time, we have to every day find a way to strike a balance between this and being journalists, and and reporting truths and reporting facts, and not sliding into something that is very tempting to somebody who's a Ukrainian journalist in this situation. It is very tempting to slide into sort of anti-Russian disinformation mode and pro-Ukraine mode, and it's something that I usually describe by saying that we, the Kyiv Independent, we are not a PR agency for Ukraine. We are not a PR agency for Ukrainian government or for Ukrainian military. We are covering Ukraine and bringing truth about Ukraine to the world and serving as the world's window into Ukraine. But at the same time, we would never, sugarcoat a story. We would never dismiss a story because we think that it might make Ukraine look bad for Western readers. And it is a difficult, in one way, it is a very simple choice because we know what we stand for. But at the same time, it is often morally difficult just because we know that, for example, when we run a story that is investigating alleged misconduct in Ukrainian military, we know that we can face, criminal persecution from Ukrainian government. We can face criticism. We can face insults. We can be called traitors for highlighting something that is not very flattering to Ukraine, and not just highlighting, but because we do it in English, it's sort of like we are bringing it to Western readers. And we acknowledge that, but at the same time, our vision of that is that we can't counter disinformation. We can't win the information war by lying and by sugarcoating things. We need to shed light on the problems, and that's something not just us are doing in Ukraine. Actually, there's sort of a renaissance of investigative journalism happening right now, because as Natalie pointed out, the efforts of investigative teams in Ukraine who used to be focused on covering corruption in the past year have been mostly focused on Russian war crimes, and they've done amazing work. But at the same time, in the past several weeks or several months, you can see sort of a renaissance happening with Ukrainian journalists again, shifting their focus to corruption inside the country, and there are different opinions about the risks of that and how it can, what kind of impact it can have on the war. Personally, I think it's great news. I think it's a sign of a healthy democracy. I think it's a sign of a very healthy environment in Ukraine.
Olga, before I jump to Peter, and I want to say I think I identified Peter with Ukraine Alert from the Eurasia Foundation, but it's the Atlantic Council. I got it two different ways, so I want to give Atlantic Council credit for that excellent publication that Peter does. But before we go to him, I want to ask you about your perspective on the Russia side of this and how Russia's own toolkit has evolved and changed, how what they're trying to do with the narratives that they've tried to implant in the West and plant in commentary, and how you become red flag. And then just one side thing I kind of feel like I want to ask you and Natalie is, how does, when you're out in the field and you're doing work in a war zone, are you targeted by Russians, or is there a respect that they try and show for the role of media? I know that's an odd question to ask, but the question, there's media on both sides of this equation. I'm going to get into this with Peter in a moment, but are Russian forces trying to target Ukrainian media, hunt them down?
So I think a quick answer to the second part of the question is they definitely don't have any respect for media. It's the opposite. We've seen it since the first days of the invasion, because the first month was really deadly for journalists who were, at least if I remember correctly, 8 journalists, mostly foreign journalists, were killed in just the first several weeks. And they mostly were killed while they were wearing, they were identified as media. They were wearing the press pages on there, and they were labeled. And something you have to remember is, first of all, people who are actually shooting at journalists, people who have killed those 8 in the beginning of the invasion, they come from a country that has been hateful for journalists for years. I mean, think back to the murder of Anna Politkovskaya. Think about the environment in Russia, and it's a country and it's a regime that sees journalists in general as a threat and as something negative. And the second component is, they think that they're in the war with the whole Western civilization, with the evil, Anglo-Saxon world or whatever. So when they see press written in English on somebody's vest, that also identifies to them that this is probably, a spy or whatever who participates in the Western propaganda or something like that. So it doesn't really shed any, doesn't give any level of protection to journalists. It's the opposite. And to the first part of your question, you asked whether Russian efforts have evolved and changed since the start of the invasion. Actually, my perspective on that is that mostly Russian propaganda and disinformation in the past year has been benefiting from the successful work of the previous years and actually decades. It's all building up on the decades of presenting Ukraine in a certain way to the world, because unfortunately Russia has been speaking about Ukraine to Western audiences much more than Ukraine itself was speaking to Western audiences, identifying itself. And that's why the West sort of is used to seeing Ukraine and Ukrainian people through this lens of Russia. And then think back to the fact that up until last year, all the bureaus of Western publications, New York Times, Washington Post, etc., they were based in Moscow, and they were covering Ukraine from their Moscow bureaus. So there's also, people who were covering Ukraine were influenced by the environment in Moscow, and there is that, and and it all manifests itself in even in mainstream media coverage.
Right, Peter. Let me ask you the similar question, because you and I have talked about this question of perspective, that early coverage of the war was essentially dominated by many Western journalists who were based in Moscow. And so that affected the calculus, it affected the frame that they brought to the war. But since that's happened, there are many, I know the head of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in the United States, for instance, who's raised a lot of money to help provide more on-the-ground coverage, at least for the US side of the coverage of Ukraine, and provide more resources. It'd be interesting to hear from Natalie and Olga whether they need more support to do what they're doing in the field. But give us your sense of how the Russian disinformation, and essentially it's not just disinformation, it's our own frame, has evolved in covering this conflict.
Yeah, I think the evolution has been very significant, and I would say it predates the invasion. It actually the key moments were the months before the invasion. If we look back now to late 2021, you had the Biden administration make a very significant decision to go public with news that the invasion was very likely coming, and to be very open about it. Presumably the objective initially was to try and dissuade Russia, but it had the effect of creating a sort of media frenzy, and Kyiv filled up with journalists. You'd go to events in Kyiv where in the past you perhaps have a handful of correspondents, and now all of a sudden you'd have hundreds. Sometimes you'd have multiple crews from the same individual outlet. You'd have multiple CNN crews or Fox News or whoever, and you had a large number of journalists. Now, the key factor here was that these were journalists who were coming from their HQs, from across Europe, from North America, from India, from wherever. Whereas in the past, Ukraine coverage was dominated by the Moscow bureaus. Now, I don't want to paint a picture of Moscow bureaus as sort of dens of Kremlin lackeys or sort of people who are totally beholden to Moscow.
They don't want to lose their access to the Bolshoi ballet.
Well, I mean, let's be frank here. These people live in Russia, so first of all, their jobs depend on the accreditation they receive from the Russian government. So if they're particularly objectionable, they will lose their jobs. That's an objective fact. They are very often people who come from a Russian studies background. They're people with a passion for Russia who've spent their university years, perhaps even school years, studying Russian culture, reading Russian history. And so their knowledge of Ukraine comes through this Russian prism. They're hearing a lot about Ukraine from Russia, and then they come down to Ukraine. They're already very, very influenced by the narratives that have been so commonplace in Russia about Ukraine for a long time. So this was a major problem for many, many years. Especially, I think it was very pronounced after 2014 with the seizure of Crimea, with the Russian invasion of East Ukraine, and this hybrid war that continued for 8 years until the invasion of last year. Throughout that period, it was very, very common to see Russian narratives appearing in the media alongside essentially the truth, as it were, alongside the reality of events, as a sort of, he said, she said. And it seemed that the journalists based in Russia had made the decision, well, I'm going to cover this, but I have to give the Russian side, even if I know personally the Russian side is false. Now, I met a lot of people who were doing this, and we spoke, off the record on a friendly basis. So I don't want to, obviously name names or embarrass anyone, but they were well aware that the Russian narratives were false. They were well aware that it wasn't true. They were well aware, and they simply hid behind the neutrality argument, saying, well, it's our responsibility to put across the Russian side. I personally believe that a lot of it was a fear of losing their jobs, fear of losing their accreditation, fear of being put out in the cold. And this was a very damaging thing because it hugely influenced coverage of Ukraine. Now, it's easy to distance yourself or to dismiss Russian disinformation, but when it's embedded in the BBC, The Guardian, CNN, internationally respected brands. It resonates, and that was a big issue.
Let me jump in because we've got about 10 minutes. I want to get a few more questions in with everyone, but I want to ask you, how has Russian messaging changed from a year ago? Now they see the terrain, they see the Kyiv Independent, they see what RFE is doing. What are they doing differently now that you think we should be paying attention to that's quite different than 12 months ago?
Well, I think that the earlier narratives, obviously the main narrative that Russia has used very, very effectively, again, prior to the invasion for a long time, was this idea of Ukraine as this far-right extremist sort of Nazi country. That's basically fallen by the wayside now. That's been exposed and pretty conclusively debunked. So you still see that a lot in the Russian media.
But I mean, I just want to say that narrative was running through American Twitter and group. I mean, I was amazed, to the topic of today, the success that Russia had in at least, getting that message transmitted by Americans and other Western folks is, oh, they're all Nazis over there. I just want to say that, I mean, these aren't, it becomes tangible at a certain point. Now, I think it's less now, but it was really, I used to run into it and couldn't believe it. But I mean, I just want to kind of note that was part of the toolkit they had, right?
No, it was massively successful. It was a superb operation, and you have to acknowledge that. You have to say that, Russia, the last year has shown that the Russian military is a paper tiger, essentially. It's a deeply incompetent organization. But Russian disinformation is world class. And the Nazi myth was extremely powerful for many years. Now, of course, it seems to have fallen down. Like today, for example, a very good example. Today we have the Israeli foreign minister in Kiev. And the Russians are going, I can't believe it. How can an Israeli go to the Nazis? But that's because that narrative has been dismissed. But now they've moved on from that. Now we're seeing a lot more talk about Ukraine is not a good partner. Ukraine should not be supported. Ukraine is corrupt. The West is corrupt. The West is fomenting this war. So they're trying to move away from the sort of Russia is right and just to, well, the West is bad and Ukraine is bad. And then we also have I think the most effective Russian narrative today is actually not taking place in the Western media space, but in the developing world, where you have in the countries of Asia and Africa, and you have Russia very effectively saying, look, we are the anti-colonial power as the Soviet Union was. We're fighting against the great American empire. So it's not about Ukraine anymore, it's about America, and it's playing on anti-Westernism, which is quite potent in these markets. Right.
Let me ask our other Ukrainian friends for a moment about narratives that seem to be emerging now. I was just in Davos, and I think one of the narratives that I won't mention names because they were on background, but one of the narratives from a very senior American economic figure was that Ukraine was highly corrupt, mismanaged its economy, and Eastern Europe, if you were to compare it to Europe, one of the worst run economies in the world. That hasn't been fixed. And after this is all solved, there will be, will they make better decisions, or will it be a corrupt cesspool? I see this beginning to emerge even on the front end of the Munich Security Conference. I'd love to hear from the Deputy Minister and also from Olga and Natalie as to how they approach those kinds of things, and what other sorts of narratives should we collectively be alert to. Deputy Minister?
If I may, I'll speak second.
Okay. How about Natalie?
Sure. I think I mentioned few of this current most fashionable narratives. I just at my first speech, but I just probably wanted to raise another dangerous thing that we see is and it's probably not about the narrative itself, but about the tool for dissemination, for its dissemination. What is striking is that we have this Telegram issue, and which is not new, but has become increasingly dangerous, as Russia is highly effective in dissemination of misinformation through such channels.
So for our audience who's watching, Telegram is a major social media platform along the lines of Twitter or something? I just want to make sure our lay audience knows what we're talking about.
There are numerous channels with millions of subscribers, and at first glance they appear to be kind of Ukrainian and created by Ukrainians. You will see a lot of information there that is true and pro-Ukrainian, and then some false thesis is thrown there, and that, for example, undermine people's trust in the government on absolutely fabricated grounds. For example, that we don't have power because the government is being selling it to the Western countries, and I'm afraid it's a really big problem that Russia is still having such massive channels for applying their psychological information operations on Ukrainians, especially in those territories which Russia is still dreaming to invade.
Great. And Olga, your thoughts?
Well, back to your original question about this narrative that Ukraine is a lost cause, a corrupt country. Well, it's a really dangerous one, and it doesn't. I mean, we have to admit, as Ukrainians, we know the history of corruption in the country has been robust, and we know that this narrative does not exactly come out of thin air. At the same time, I think what is more characteristic is, you know, how they say, a reaction to mistake is more characteristic than the mistake itself. So it should be, you know, if the Ukrainian government and administration now reacts to allegations of corruption in a way that is very decisive, which they have at least been trying to do in the recent weeks. We've seen some, you know, the showcases of like very public raids of oligarchs' premises and so on, and you know, a top official being fired after some corruption allegation and so on. So I think if the Ukrainian leadership plays it right, plays it well, this can actually be an opportunity. And you know, if you want to sort of simplify it, it can make the Western public, you know, fall in love with the actions of Ukrainian leadership once again. You know, they are already in love with the resilience and with this aspect of the bravery, how bravely Ukrainians fight. They can, you know, there is a ground here to create, you know, there is another opportunity. Maybe Western audiences can fall in love with how decisive and merciless the Ukrainian leadership is about corruption. So it actually presents a very good opportunity, like you know, if you want to be sort of crude, a PR opportunity for Ukraine. But it is, if this is not the direction in which the government goes, if it's not how they move, then it is potentially a very damaging narrative.
Let me ask you both. I know the deputy minister is dividing his time between two meetings. He's very busy, but we really appreciate his time. And I want to go to questions from our audience soon. But I think, you know, I was talking to the former president of Croatia, fascinating woman whose experience was shaped in part by the Soviet era. Her grandmother and mother were saying at one point, when before the Soviets had rolled in, that they believed that the West, that America would stop it, that they would be there for them. And one of the most crushing realities when they realized that their livelihood and their futures had been forfeited by what they thought would be the values and protection of the West. I thought it was a very honest and candid statement. It was hard for me as an American to hear it. I'm interested in how, you know, with eyes wide open, you're looking at the West's role right now. Is it enough? Is it too tepid? Is it under what it should be? How do you, as reporters and commentators, because I look at you, particularly you, Olga, as allowed to have opinions like I am, but Natalie and others are essentially reporting on, you know, objective journalism. But I'm interested in what the temperature is with regard to how they're looking at what we're doing. Because in the United States, I have to say, we're filled with a confidence about what we're doing. I'm not sure it's enough, actually, but what are your perspectives, Olga?
Well, you know, I think the general feeling that Ukrainians now have towards Western allies and the aid that we're getting is so first, of course, there is a layer of general gratitude and the feeling of alliance and gratitude for all the aid that we've been getting. But at the same time, there's a very present, very strong realization and understanding that we here are paying the ultimate price. It's our friends, brothers, and others who are being killed fighting off Russia. So as many weapons as we can get from the West, it's Ukrainians who are going to be losing their lives at the front line. So I think that plus the understanding that this is not, nobody thinks of it as the war between Ukraine and Russia anymore, right? This is the war between two sets of values that is decisive about. This is where the future of the world is being decided right now. How the world is shaped in the next decades and decades to come is being decided on the ground in Ukraine right now. So knowing that, I think most of my peers in Ukraine feel that we deserve to get more aid and all the aid that can be provided, since we are the ones who are doing the actual fighting, and we are fighting sort of on behalf of the world. And I think it is really frustrating for at least for many people that I talk to, for Ukrainians, that to see all the hesitation, to see the politics around issues like providing battle tanks and so on and so on. It's really frustrating, and it's hurting, honestly, to to read and see all these tragic stories of the lives lost on the front line, and at the same time read that as we read several months ago, that Germany does not want to provide battle tanks for Ukraine because it's not going to look good for German tanks to face Russian tanks again because of some wounds coming back to World War II. So that argument is so thin and honestly offensive, I think, for anybody in Ukraine for whom this fight is so close. So there is a mix of gratitude, but also frustration about the delay and the hesitation.
Thank you. Natalie, let me get your comments, and I'll get Peter and then Taras. Natalie?
Yes.
Do we still have
Do you
Natalie?
hear me?
Yeah. Yes, great. Would love to get your thoughts.
Sure. Well, I fully agree with Olga on, especially on what she was saying about anti-corruption investigative reporting, which my team is, for example, still continue doing, and we are aimed to continue doing. And why I'm saying this here, because I strongly believe that independent media in Ukraine has always played a big role in the country's recent history, and this is what significantly sets us apart from Russia and what prevented our state from sliding into the grips of Russian authoritarianism. And therefore, even in times of war, this should be a constant reminder to Ukrainian authorities that independent and professional media are your partners. But also, if we are speaking about our support from the West, I think I want to just emphasize that I'm confident that this should be independent media should be a reliable guarantee for our Western partners who are currently helping Ukraine resist Russian aggression, that Ukraine foreign partners can rely on independent media and active civil society, that we are not going to silence our problems because we are particularly interested in ensuring that there are no weak links, and then those in power respond to issues that we raise. And the only reason why we are raising it is to solve the problem and to make the country stronger.
Natalie, real short form, do you have the resources you need to do your job?
Well, yes, and the main support, I think, is dissemination of information. So a little commercial here. We do our best. We put some more resources into trying to adopt our investigations, not only about Russian war crimes, but also about Ukrainian problems in the government. And we are adapting it to the English language audience, and you can find them at our main website, rfurl.org. So this is to show that we are conducting both investigations in both directions. We are not silencing problems, but we are not Russia, we're raising problems to make government solve them until it's not too late.
Great. Your thoughts, Peter?
Well, on the subject of whether the West is doing enough, I think that it's never enough, frankly, and it's difficult for Ukraine because, of course, they don't want to seem like this incredibly demanding partner that's always saying more, more, more. And this is also something that Russia has latched onto and has betrayed Ukraine and Zelensky in particular as a kind of beggar who's going around, or a hustler even, who's going around and constantly saying, you know, give me this, give me that, give me the money, give me the tanks. Okay, we've got the tanks. Now we want the jets. We've got the jets. And so this can be quite a damaging perception, I think, in terms of, you know, domestic electorates where people are saying, oh, hold on, we've got, you know, we need money to fix the water system or this system, or people can't pay their gas bills. And yet we're sending another 5 billion, another 3 billion, another however much to Ukraine. So that is you know, in the information space, that is a challenge that Ukraine has to face. But from a Ukrainian perspective, it's never enough. And I think that, you know, the Ukrainians feel that it's you know, it's a lot cheaper to pay to fight Russia today in Ukraine than it will be to fight Russia in you know, maybe 5 years' time or 2 years' time, if Ukraine were to fall, God forbid, and we had a situation where the Russians then would be stronger and they would be more aggressive and they would be looking to go further, and then Europe and the West would face the same problem from a much weaker position, and it would cost a lot more. So I think Ukraine, the message I often hear in Ukraine, and that I would agree with, is that it makes sense. It's actually a good deal to finance Ukraine now and to support them. And that's a message I think we need to see more of in the international media. But we are seeing that. I think, you know, despite the criticism, generally speaking, you know, support does remain quite strong, both political and public.
Well, good. Well, thank you. And I'm sure some of you have seen me move around. We do what we have to do and be resilient in this, you know, given the fact that our Wi-Fi at the hotel is not working. Let me ask Taras Shevchenko, the Deputy Prime Minister, to reflect on this for a moment. And I think Olga Rudenko framed it quite well and said that she sees this not just as a matter of Ukraine and the West, but right now the rules of the world, the operating system of the world, the values of the world are being fought right now in Ukraine. So there's greater import than just what's going on in the field. So would love to hear from Taras what that kind of burden means to you, and that obligation, if you will, and whether or not, just candidly, the West is doing enough.
Very good question, or actually several questions. I think Ukrainians has a feeling that it's not just a war for Ukraine, but it's kind of support of Western values, Western democracies, and being a front line and a shield for other European countries. So if Russians were not stopped here near the Kyiv, then they would be definitely going further and trying to claim as more territories as they could. And as for the question, if the support is enough, there was already quite a good answer that it's never enough. And when we speak about our field, the field of media and culture, as I represent the Ministry of Culture and Informational Policy, we trying to cooperate in the best way we can with other governments, with our counterparts in other ministries, and asking for additional support for the culture, for saving our national heritage, for supporting media markets. We communicate with TV channel Freedom in Russian language toward the Russian speaking population in Russia and in other countries, and would love to have bigger cooperation and bigger support for that project as well, and have many other possible projects for cooperation and for support.
Well, thank you for that. Now I'm going to invite questions, and we've got the team at RFE is going to help feed questions to me. But I want to ask Steve Myers of the New York Times, a good friend, to ask if he'd like to go first with us and pose a question to our panelists. Stephen there?
Steve's not going to be able to pose that question verbally.
Okay.
However, if people could please offer their questions through the Q&A section, that would be the optimal way to make it happen.
Okay, through the Q&A session. Okay. We have an anonymous attendee for Natalie who says, how are things on the ground in Ukraine? Natalie?
Well, wait a second. Do you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
First of all, we are now facing as millions of Ukrainians, regardless the profession or activity, the question of survival in general. Tonight, I woke up at, as Olga and Tarais, I believe, I woke up at 3 a.m. From a sound of sirens and an airstrike alert. And in the morning, I read in the news that during this night's airstrike, Russia fired 36 heavy missiles at Ukraine. And our air defense hit only 16 of them. Others reached their goals. And after a year of full-scale war, we have no weapons capable of destroying this type of missiles. And as we read, the goal was again Ukrainian critical infrastructure, which means a heat and power for regular people. And yes, in April, as Jamie mentioned, one of such Russian heavy missiles hit directly the apartment of our colleague in the center of Kyiv, RFE producer Vera Hirich, who died. So I just want to add for the challenges in professional meaning, journalists who just a year ago wrote about national policy and covered domestic reforms are now war correspondents, wearing body armor and helmets, underwent survival first aid trainings, and now travel to frontline cities, areas littered with mines and bombed from the air to record the latest history of our state. And at RFE Ukrainian service, both news correspondents and investigative reporters are doing this. So this is how it is, how it feels for us on the ground. And thanks for the question.
Thank you much. And we've got a lot of great questions. I do want to mention, because someone has asked how they can find the access of this recording of this great discussion later. I believe it's YouTube. It will be posted on YouTube. Martins, if I'm wrong, you can correct me later. But I also have a good question for Olga, which is, what is the role of investigative journalism when it comes to the prosecution of war crimes? Olga?
Well, I mean, I can answer, but I think the best person to answer this is actually Natalie, because her team is exactly that. She's leading an investigative journalism team that is doing exactly that. They are investigating Russian war crimes.
Yes,
okay, Natalie?
Sure, definitely. There were already a number of official investigations that were opened by Ukrainian prosecutor and law enforcement after we published a story. And they come to us and they say that they're going to open this investigation, and they will rely on the materials and they will double check it. And already one indictment was announced to a Russian soldier who was conducting war crimes in the near Kyiv, and it was firstly it was our journalistic investigations. So definitely we see this kind of an impact that our stories are being taken seriously and being picked up by the law enforcement.
Thank you. Peter, we have a question.
Hi, it looks like Steve's audio video has frozen for a moment. In the meantime, If I could continue and ask the question of Peter. You recently wrote for the Atlantic Council that Russia is on the cusp of losing the information war. What makes you think that this is the case, given Russia's enormous investment in its disinformation platforms?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that the challenge that Russia has, and the reason why I said that it's on the cusp of losing, is partly what we spoke about earlier, the idea that the influence of Moscow-based correspondence has been dramatically reduced. But I think also because of simply because of the exposure that Ukraine has got over the past year, the advantages that Russia had for a long time was the fact that Ukraine was very unknown internationally. Some of my colleagues today have already very, very correctly noted that Ukraine did not spend a lot of time communicating with the international community over the 30 years of independence, in fact. And that left Ukraine almost as a blank sheet of paper, which Russia would often, could draw what it wanted on. Mostly it would draw a swastika or something like that. And that was what people's perceptions of Ukraine were: a corrupt country, an extremist country, etc. However, the past year has sort of debunked a lot of those myths because so many journalists have come to Ukraine and seen for themselves. So I think that's one reason. And we see this, and the article specifically pointed out some of the particularly awkward moments that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has had when he's been caught out by journalists who've said, how can Ukraine be a Nazi country if they have a Jewish president? For example, and Lavrov has responded by saying, well, Hitler also had Jewish roots, which was a particularly glaring error that rebounded very negatively on his perceptions of him internationally and on Russia. So I think Russia's narratives were for a long time taken on board by a lot of the international community because for want of something else. What we've seen over the past year is a much greater awareness of what's happening in Ukraine and what the realities of Ukraine are. So gradually, Ukraine's voice is becoming louder, and Russia's disinformation is being exposed.
Great, thanks, Peter. Let me use the opportunity as Steve's connection comes back online to remind everybody to use the Q&A section to be able to ask questions, and also to make a plug for RFERL's Twitter feeds at RFERL Press, at RFERL, and for Jamie Fly at Jamie M. Fly. There you'll be able to track this event and our work in Ukraine and Russia, and also get that link for on-demand review of the event once we post that up onto YouTube. Steve?
Well, thank you, and my apologies for losing my connection down here again. It's not, try to get resilience. I feel it from my journalist friends. They're in the field in Ukraine, try to be in the field in Florida. But in any case, Daniel Langenkamp says, we haven't much discussed the role of civil society organizations in fighting disinformation. These organizations are quite active in Ukraine. How important has their role been in the fight against Russia's disinformation machine? And, I know that Jamie Fly is not on the panel. I don't know if he's still with us, but Jamie has been one of the leaders in Washington, not only with Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, but previous in many organizations, of seeding in them the capacity to do this. I don't want to answer for him, but let me go to Peter on this one. Peter?
I think going back to the early days of the conflict in 2014, Ukraine then was a kind of pioneering country in terms of debunking Russian disinformation, and there was a lot of effort. There was most famously was the Stop Fake organization was set up after the seizure of Crimea, and for a long time I think efforts focused on that. But there are limits to how much debunking can do. I think when you come out after a major disinformation thing has been put out into the public sphere, when you come out and try to bring it back or say, well, actually this is not true, you actually can find that it's counterproductive. A, you'll probably reach a much smaller audience, and B, you may end up just amplifying it. You may end up amplifying the original disinformation. So debunking is I think it's fair to say it's necessary. It's important to come out and say this is not true, but I think we shouldn't expect it to be a panacea. okay, if you come out and show if you expose something as untrue, then it ceases to be a problem. I think the main issue is storytelling, is telling Ukraine's story, is telling more compelling stories. And the Ukrainian media has been very good, increasingly strong in that direction. Civil society has also been active in that direction, and this is what I would certainly personally encourage. Tell the stories that Ukraine has in abundance. That's what's compelling, and that's what's going to really reach international audiences. And it is working, I think, to a degree.
Let me ask Olga this, because I am very familiar with the Kyiv Independent. I regularly read and check into it, but it seems to me, Olga, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you've really reached out to many organizations that might provide surround sound for distribution in the West. How is that going? Are you being heard to the degree you want to be heard around the world? Are there, to Daniel's point, are there partnerships out there yet still to be had to help elevate and broaden your voice?
Yeah, we did a lot in this area last year. We signed, I can't give you the exact number, but we signed quite a few syndication deals, including one of the latest was with Yahoo, to be present on that platform. And that gives us access to, the audience that is much bigger than our website's audience, even on its on its best days. And it's very important, and we are seeking it as a way to just reach more eyeballs, and to have now when you go to on Yahoo, for example, if you go to the world section, in that stream of news from CNN and whoever, you will see at least 3 Ukrainian local news outlets pop up: us, Ukrainska Pravda, and Новое Время, and the New Voice of Ukraine. So it's so important to have the Ukraine perspective there, because as wonderful as the job, while many international correspondents for mainstream global media are doing amazing work in Ukraine, there are unfortunately many cases when Russian propaganda and Russian disinformation narratives slide into their reporting. So that's why I think it's very important to have voices like ours. If I have time to give one recent example, I have just read an article in the New Yorker that came out, I believe, yesterday, and the article was titled "How Ukrainians Think About Russians Now." And right there in the lead, as one of the first sentences in the article, the journalist covering the issue writes that the issue of Ukrainians realizing their identity is complicated by the fact that many of them grew up in Russian-speaking families. And that's such a dangerous thing to throw out there without context, because that implies to somebody who's not very familiar with the issue, that implies that Ukrainians who are Russian-speaking are pro-Russian or identify as Russian, at least partly. And that is not true. I can say that as somebody who grew up speaking Russian. I've never felt Russian for a second in my life. And 2, this is one of the most successful and most important Russian fake narratives about Ukraine. The division presenting as the Western Ukraine that is pro-Western, and the Eastern Ukraine that is pro-Russian and identifies as Russian. So, and it was in the New Yorker. It was by a very reputable journalist. But that's just an example of how it can subtly slide into mainstream reporting.
Well, thank you. Let me ask just finally in our last couple of minutes, Taras Shevchenko, who I hope is still with us. Taras, are you with us?
Yes.
Just share with us again, from your personal perspective, if not the government as well, as you look forward. We're on the edge of the Munich Security Conference just starting. Ukraine is going to be the top billed discussion of what's going on. I'd just be interested in this question, which we started with, which is the evolution of Russian disinformation. What red flags are you going to be wary of looking forward out of Munich? What would disappoint you? What would give you some hope that the world is going to be in the right place in terms of interpreting what you're doing on the information front versus what Russia's doing? And we'll conclude there.
I'm not sure I got your question properly. I believe that the world is already.
Well, look, I mean, let me just say the world is going to be. The world is going to be discussing you at Munich Security Conference these next few days. It's the most important convening of national security officials, lots of media there. I think it's going to be the playground where we see play out in real form what we're discussing here today, is how successful is Russian messaging in that arena? How successful are the efforts to debilitate or to counter that messaging going to be? I'd just be interested in your sense of what you hope to see, what you fear you'll see.
My sense is that there are many platforms and places where Ukraine is discussed and where Russia would like to have their narratives be present. But I believe that within Western democracies, Russia is absolutely losing with having support to their narratives. The places where they are successful is Latin America, Asia, Africa, like the global South. That's where we see much weaker positions, actually position of democracy itself and position of democratic countries and position of Ukraine. While within Western countries, we think that they completely lost the battle for minds of people and minds of decision makers. And in this regard, I also want to thank Europeans and other people who are supporting Ukraine and don't trust Russian media.
Well, I want to thank you, Deputy Minister Taras Shevchenko, Olga Rudenko, Natalie Sedletska, and Peter Dickinson, as well as Jamie Fly and the entire team at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I'm Steve Clemons. I'm editor-at-large of Semaphore. I want to thank all of you. I think we achieved what our goal was, which was to have a consequential discussion on the changing topography of Russian disinformation and also what the toolkit is to respond to it. So let me thank all of you, and we'll conclude this meeting now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.